London system is a strong opening. It has been played by the likes of Magnus, Hikaru, and Ding Liren. The London is much more than just a beginner opening. In this video, I'll show you how to play the London system. Stick around till the end to see my analysis of Ding Liren's London Masterclass. The London system is an opening that always starts with d4 from white, and black's response can be a different move than this, but say for example we've got knight to f6, and then white can play two different moves here to go into a London system. You can delay your bishop with knight to f3, or you can play the immediate bishop to f4, and this is the main way that people play the London system, starting with bishop f4. And now we're officially in the London system. And as you see here, black has a whole bunch of different responses, main one being d5 here, and now we're in the accelerated London system. And the London system is a very systematic opening, as the name would imply, of course. You're going to make very familiar moves every game, and that's what makes it great for beginners, especially, is you don't have to think about what move you have to make in each position. You can just make a move that intuitively fits your structure. So the move you always make in the London system is this lovely move e3, which is going to open up your light squared bishop and also prepare you for castling, because you're going to need to get this bishop out so you can castle kingside. So your opponent goes for a very common move c5. c5 is one of the best moves to use to challenge the London, and a lot of the time when your opponent plays c5, you're going to go with the move c3. So you're starting to see the setup we get here. We've got the triangle with the little tower, and it kind of looks like the Big Ben, I guess you could say. This is why it's called the London system. And our pieces are going to go to very natural squares. So say our opponent goes for, let's say bishop, let's go to the first symmetrical London. They go for bishop to f5. We're going to go for bishop d3. Then our opponent plays e6, and we're going to go for knight f3. And our opponent goes for knight c6. Our other knight is going to come and reinforce on d2. And you get a setup that looks like this, where the knights are, let's exchange these bishops first so nothing's hanging. Alright. So you get your knights connected here, very soundly protecting each other, and you've also got your bishop here controlling the central square. And this e5 square is the main square in the London that you want to control. Your pawn on d4 is controlling that square, so is your pieces, and a lot of the time what you're going to do is try to fight for this e5 square and try to put a knight on it. So sometimes you do the reroute of your knights where you have a knight jump to e5 and your other knight jumps to f3 to reinforce it. So say for example this position, black goes bishop to e7 and white castles, black castles, and say we get rook c1. We're starting to play along the open file here, which is another feature of the London, is when your opponent plays c5, which is common, and you respond with c3, you get a mutually open c file that you can play with, and you can use the open file to your advantage. So there's a lot of different elements in the London, but the main ones you want to play for this e5 square. So eventually we're going to be looking to play this knight e5 move. Say for example, opponent plays this move here, and now our knight's going to e5. And here we're starting to see a little bit of interaction between the pieces. Our opponent can take, and we can take back with the bishop. And our bishop's starting to access a nice diagonal here. Our queen also now has access to f3, which is an amazing square for the queen, targeting two different points. Or our knight can go to f3. So we're starting to see the pieces in the London activate very easily once they're traded off, and you're able to create a lot of pressure using your queen as well as your knights. Now, what are some common ideas in the London system? Well, for example here, a very common move in the London is to go with queen b6 for black. Black wants to put pressure on this b pawn and kind of punish us for developing our dark squared bishop so early. If our dark squared bishop wasn't developed, this pawn would not be really a weakness. Now, the very common move to play here, and it's not the best move in this scenario if you look at the engine, but one of the best moves to play in this kind of position where our opponent goes queen b6 is to counter with queen to b3. Now, queen to b3 is a nice move. It allows you position for a reason that you might not realize. Now you've created this pressure between the queens, and trading queens is not necessarily in the favor of black. Black's queen, it was kind of a nice piece, creating pressure on the center, also creating pressure on the pawn here. And trading queens is neutralizing that pressure. Not to mention that you don't really want to ever be the one to take like this. This pawn structure is actually pretty good for white because white does get the open file, as well as white being able to now prepare this move c4 and challenge d5. So the principle here is you want to counter with your queen, and you don't want to be the one to take, if possible. Sometimes you're forced to take. Like here, if our opponent closes the center with c4, they've given you something else to play for, and you can capitalize on that move c4. So giving them the doubled pawns is not that big of a deal. But you can also just drop your queen back. And now you're defending b2. You've induced this weakening move c4. And why is c4 weakening for black? Well, I'll explain that in a second. But first, notice the extremely good placement of this queen. This pawn is very difficult to defend for black in a comfortable way. Black can play g6 and bishop g7, or black can retreat one of their knights, probably this knight here. But the queen has no way to access the defense of this square. So this move becomes very good because of that. But notice this, now that the pawn is committed to c4, there's no more pressure on white center. White center is unimpeded and strong, and it's not going to be challenged anytime soon. And also now you can chip away at black's pawn structure in the center by playing a move like b3, which now, take for example, bishop e7, and we get b3. Now we can force an exchange and create another isolated pawn over here that is going to be difficult to defend as well. Notice how we're creating a doubled attack on this pawn, so black has to defend that pawn. Not only that, but you're creating an open file to use for your rook against the queen. So that c4 move is not something that your opponent ever really wants to play if they're not going to force a trade of queens. So sometimes you do get this trade of queens. And this trade of queens is so nice for the aforementioned reasons. Of course, the open file and the c4 break. Not only that, you've just got another pawn controlling some key squares that a knight may try to access at some point. Like this c4 square could become weak. Opponent could access it through a5, but this pawn on b3 is a godsend at defending those weak light squares. Notice you've traded off the light square bishops. There's nothing defending. Another key idea you need to know in the London is making space for your bishop. There's a lot of positions where, say for example, opponent goes knight to c6 and we get knight f3, and our opponent sees the opportunity to claim our bishop and they go for knight to h5. Now here, knight to h5 is actually a pretty good move, and there's not really much we can do about losing this bishop. But if we had been a little bit more proactive, say for example on this turn instead we had played h3, we create the left square for our bishop, and now when we play these two moves, I'll put another move in there. Yeah, now we will play this move. The bishop has a square to go to, and this square is nice, and the bishop is just as good on this square as it is on any of the other square, because it is still controlling this long diagonal that we wanted to control, and it's out of harm's way. We're going to be able to develop this bishop, castle, and be perfectly fine here. Alright, and this was Game 6 between Ding Liren and Jan Nepomniachtchi in the most recent World Chess Championship. This was in 2023. And you're going to see a very familiar opening being played here. d4, knight f6, we get knight to f3, d5, and then bishop to f4, the London system. And this is a very interesting opening at the time, because a lot of the time in the World Championship, people play d4 main line, so you see a lot of d4, c4, and you don't see that much of the London system in the World Championship, because people prepare very deeply in very theoretical openings. Not usually the London system, which isn't that theoretical. So when Jan Nepomniachtchi saw this, he probably was very surprised, but he most certainly had prepped for the London system, so he played his move, c5, and we get e3, knight c6, knight to d2, pawn takes, and bishop to f5. So we've got a very symmetrical kind of setup here, except not very symmetrical. Sorry. We get the typical exchange here where the e-pawn takes back, and we get what's called the Carlsbad structure. Carlsbad structure is a very common pawn structure that comes out of the London system. It also comes out of the exchange Caro-Kann or the Queen's Gambit declined. And the Carlsbad structure is signified by one opponent has an open e file and the other person has an open c file, and that's the asymmetry of the position. So white is likely going to play c3, and black is likely going to play e6, and we're going to have a connected threes in the center, and we're going to see who can use their open file better and abuse the advantages of each individual thing they've been given in the position. So opponent goes for bishop to f5, and Ding plays the call move c3, creating that three stack of pawns I was talking about. And Jan Nepomniachtchi responds in the same way, creating the three stack of pawns with e6. And here we get bishop to b5, a very nice move, just pinning the knight, trying to induce some sort of queenside pawn thrust. But Jan doesn't bite. He goes for bishop d6, offering a trade of dark square bishops, and Ding goes for it, allowing for the dark squares to become a little bit more weakened, and maybe this e5 square will become weakened enough that Ding can eventually use it for his knight. But Ding castles, and so does Jan. And Ding goes for rook to e1, abusing the open file that he's created by creating the pawn Carlsbad structure. And we've got h6 from Jan, disallowing the move knight to g5. And here we get knight to e5. So we see this idea that I mentioned earlier in the video coming into action. The knight from f3 jumps into e5, and likely Ding is going to try to route his knight to f3, or something else may happen in this game. We'll have to find out. So first thing that Jan does is he routes his knight backwards to e7, and he may redeploy his knight through g6 at any point, but he doesn't want to allow this trade of pawns to happen to create a weak backwards pawn here that Ding can capture. And Ding goes for a4, a very interesting move, which may allow a rook lift, but also just disallowing the pawn from going to a4 itself after a5. So it's kind of a preemptive move, but it also isn't allowing a rook lift if possible. And here, Jan goes for the move a6, knocking bishop away. Bishop goes all the way back to f1, which is really nice. The bishop may fianchetto itself. It may also just stay here on the nice f1 square, controlling this diagonal just as well as it was before. So yeah, here we get a sort of inaccuracy from Jan. Knight to d7, and the knight is taken. Takes back for the queen, and then we get a5. Now this is a very complex move, but the idea here is to create what's called a deep freeze. Now in the endgame, this is what's known as a deep freeze, where one pawn is halting the advancement of two different pawns. In the endgame, this is an invaluable asset for your position, because you've got this pawn that's tying down your opponent's two pawns. This pawn can't move forward without being captured, and this pawn also needs to defend a6, so that this bishop is just creating long-term pressure on it, isn't just going to capture it. So we have these weakened pawns now because of the nice move a5, and I really like that move from Ding. Queen goes over to c7, creating pressure on this a5 pawn, also just controlling the c file, which it's the asset that Jan had been given from the opening. And here we get queen to f3, nice move, creating pressure on the center. Also, just generally, queen on the king side is nice for attacking. Queen may go over to g3 and offer a queen trade as well. Here we get rook to c8, and he's creating pressure down a file, but for now there's no real pressure because the pawn is defended by the queen and the other pawn. Here we get rook to a3, which is a nice move too, lifting the rook and giving the option for rook to b3 on the next move. Bishop drops back to g6. Nice move, just getting the bishop out of the way and possibly paving the way for the knight to come to f5. And knight to b3. So that knight that we thought was going to reinforce on f3, Ding has decided to use on b3. And his idea is very simple here. He wants to get his knight to this lovely c5 square, which this a5 pawn is also helping with creating an outpost, making it so this pawn can't advance and knock away the knight because it will just be taken. And so here, Ding Jan does go for knight to c5, not knight to c5, knight to c6, creating more pressure on the a5 pawn. And here, Ding offers the queen trade, and it's a nice move because it is forcing. And queen slides over to e7, and we get this interesting move, h4. Now you wouldn't think to move a pawn on the king side, but here it's not really that weakening because there's no way for black to use this file, and this pawn may run down the board and create havoc, allowing this bishop to be knocked back, and also maybe even clearing up a way for the white queen to have an attack on the king, which would be kind of amazing for white. Alright, so this is kind of an aimless move to me. Rook to e7, I guess the idea is to eventually break with, rook to e7, rook to e8. The idea is to break with e5, maybe f6 and e5, I don't know. But you need to do something in the center here. And with this queen on the file, it's hard to break because the rook is just kind of pinning the pawn. But here we do finally get the nice move, knight to c5, where this pawn is not able to advance. And we're having an amazing knight on c5 for Ding. Alright, here we get e5. And then we get rook b3, creating pressure on this pawn here. The queen is the only defender. We have to find a defender. So first, opponent takes the pawn on a5 with a knight. Then rook takes on e5. Queen moves. And then we get rook back to a3. So the whole time that rook was hanging, but the queen was hanging, so it wasn't actually hanging. It's a very complicated tactical sequence, but Ding Liren finds the best way. Knight jumps to c4, creating a fork on the rooks, so bishop must be traded off. And then we get h5, which is a very interesting move. Looks like it just hangs a pawn. But Jan Nepomniachtchi doesn't go for it. He goes for bishop to c2, hoping to control some of these light squares that have been very weakened for white, because all of his pawns are on dark squares. We get knight takes b7, queen b6, knight to d6, which is a very interesting move because of this tactical idea. Queen takes d6, and then rook takes e8. And then you'd be forced to take back, and the queen would be lost in the process. So of course, Jan Nepomniachtchi doesn't fall for this. Takes, and then queen takes b2. So now we've got this hanging rook here, and we've got this outside passed pawn for black. But white is drumming up a strong attack on the king side here. These pawns are weak, and there's going to be an attack that may be devastating for black. So we get rook to a5. King goes to h7, so it's not vulnerable on the back rank. And we get rook to c5 from Ding. Queen c1, king h2. And we get f6, knocking the queen off its nice post on e5, where it's really controlling a lot of squares on the board. Queen drops all the way back to g3, creating pressure. And the next move for white is going to be rook to c7. Opponent goes for a5. But first, Ding takes here. And he actually decides to go for this interesting move, knight to e3, creating pressure on this pawn here, not this pawn, this bishop, as well as cutting off the queen's retreat. So the queen could retreat to g5 and block the queen's influence here. And that's the move that Jan was relying on in case of a move like rook to c7. Jan was relying that the queen could drop back and block any sort of check. But here, the queen's influence over that square has been lost, so now there's an immediate threat. Bishop drops back. Now the rook goes in, and the rook has to come all the way over instead of the queen being able to drop back. So now the rook is being forced to play this very defensive role. Knight's going to jump in to d5. King goes back, and rook goes over, creating pressure on this pawn, which now must be defended. And we get a3, which defends the pawn. And it looks like black is going to create a queen, and it's going to get traded off, and then black is going to be up a full rook. But Ding Liren is a little bit more, he thinks a little farther ahead than the rest of us. So he starts off with his knight e7, rook has to move, And then he goes for this very interesting move, d5, which doesn't look like it does much, but in reality, it is an invaluable move that without it, he would not be able to win the game. At this point, when I was watching this myself, I was watching it live, and I really didn't understand what d5 was, but I knew that Ding did. Ding did not just play this move for some random reason, and we're about to see why Ding played this amazing move d5. So he calculates pawn to a2. Then we get this amazing move queen c7, which is creating an attack on the g7 pawn through the knight. So the knight can be moved with check, and then the threat is knight to g6 check. King moves anywhere, and then checkmate. So of course, Jan has to move his king so that this knight cannot move with check. Knight moves anyways. Knight to g6. Now the rook must defend this pawn because this pawn is vulnerable and white is threatening checkmate. So rook defends. And then amazing move that only Ding could have seen, queen to f7. And his idea is very simple. He's going to take the rook and then give a check. And then the only square for the king to go to is this f7 square. And then the rook is going to slide over and give an amazing Arabian mate on f8. And it's going to be checkmate. And this pawn, the whole purpose of it was to close this square off to the king. The king is not going to be able to escape because that pawn is blocking the only escape square. And in this position here, actually, Jan Nepomniachtchi resigned because he saw the variations. There's no way to stop checkmate in this position. Of course, the variation I was talking about was, let's say he promotes, and we get takes, give a check here, and then this amazing checkmate like this, where the king has nowhere to go. The knight is protecting the rook is restricting the squares. Knight's covering this square, and the pawn contributes and covers the last square, which is amazing. Not to mention that, but if this rook moves anywhere, queen gives checkmate, and it's basically over. There's no way for Jan Nepomniachtchi to survive this, so he resigns. And just an amazing move from Ding Liren. Seeing this d5 move from this far out, I mean, this checkmate is really hard to see. Queen c7, and then you got to see the whole idea of queen f7 after that. I mean, this is the world chess champion for a reason. So anyways, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I really had a good time making it, and have a good rest of your day. See ya.